Alrighty, let's talk Magic the Gathering. This is episode 2 of my deck design series, and if you haven't already, I highly recommend you watch the first part of the series, especially part 1 of episode 1, because a lot of principles we establish in this episode, I'm going to build on these in this episode. Last time I talked a lot about the function and purpose of specific cards, and we're going to go a bit deeper in this episode. Specifically, I'm going to talk about finding solutions to problems. So, most decks, or pretty much every deck, has strengths and weaknesses, and most of the time you want to build on your strengths of the deck to have it extremely streamlined and powerful. And this kind of approach can get you easily to top 8 usually, and you're just accepting that you're going to be unfavored in some matchups. And to most people this is fine, but in my experience, or the way I approached it recently, is to try to balance out the weaknesses of the deck to have much more consistent results. To do that, you have to find solutions or answers to the bad matchups or specific cards you struggle against. And I'm going to talk about 2 legacy decks I have quite a bit of experience with, and then of course 2 vintage decks. So, the first deck we're going to look at is a Reanimate deck. I think the deck is pretty understood and there's not a lot I need to explain. And first I'd like to look at the pre-board setup, because in Reanimate the post-board matchups are a lot different than your pre-board matchups for quite obvious reasons. So, to understand the pre-board matchup, you need to think about cards that you struggle against, or rather specific matchups. And usually the way it goes is you're highly favored in the first game, because they don't have hate and a lot of cards they play are dead. Cards like Abrupt Decay or generally Removal is dead. A lot of beatdown creatures are just too slow, so to beat Reanimate you need to have a lot of counter magic, a lot of disruption, otherwise you're going to lose. And the deck is insanely strong at beating all kinds of aggro mid-range decks, so everything that doesn't play blue basically is quite easy to deal with. Pre-board, that is. And the only cards that can actually mess with you quite heavily are Deathrite Shaman, which is the worst basically, and Caracas is an issue as well, specifically in Death and Taxes. In some other decks it's a one-off, it's probably not worth considering, but in Death and Taxes it can actually be quite hard, even if you have a Griselbrand on the battlefield, which is already a little bit annoying to do because they have a lot of mana denial. And Caracas is generally an issue because they can repeatedly just bounce almost all of your creatures. So both these cards are kind of hard to interact with, especially because, well, one of them is not a spell, so you can't really counter it, and the other one just costs 1 mana, which means Daze usually doesn't just cut it. And do you really want to force a Deathrite Shaman? Sometimes you have to, but it's quite bad. And the way I have decided to deal with this issue is to, 1, be very fast with the 4 Lotus Petals. You can actually, even on the draw, you can just reanimate something even if they have Deathrite Shaman on the battlefield already. And the second way is with including Pithing Needle. And Pithing Needle solves both problems quite well. And I actually haven't played this deck in quite a while, and when I played it last time at a tournament, top was still in the metagame, which is quite a hard matchup, Miracles. And Pithing Needle even stopped since I started winning top, which also solved a lot of problems. So it's pretty good main deck as a as a catch-all solution for your issues. And what also happened quite frequently is I would like reanimate the Crystal Brand, and of the cards you drew, you could usually find like Lotus Beetle and Pithing Needle, which is quite decent, to be honest. So, postboard, obviously a lot of things change, because most people will have some way of interacting with your graveyard postboard in some very efficient way. Since Miracles is not really a deck anymore, I guess it sees play, but not as frequently. Most people don't play Rest in Peace, which is, I usually ignore the existence of the card. I mean, I have Show and Tell just like any other Reanimate deck, and Show and Tell is quite obviously designed to counter all kinds of graveyard interaction, and it's quite decent at that, but in my opinion, the strength of Reanimate comes from its explosiveness, and like it has a lot of ways to actually reanimate creatures. You can even do it twice, so something like Tormod Script you can actually just power through even without Show and Tell, and Show and Tell just requires a lot of resources. You have to get to at least 3, possibly 4 lands to play around days and stuff like that. It can be countered quite easily, therefore, and you also need to keep a creature in your hand, and you can't tutor for your creature with Entomb, and so on. So it's not... It deals with issues of your deck, but it shouldn't be your first approach. So basically, postboard matchups are defined by the way you sideboard against their sideboard. And the cards that are the biggest issues are Containment Priest and Deathrite Shaman, in my opinion. So originally I thought, well, if I'm already playing red, I might as well play Lightning Bolt because it clearly solves these issues. And the issue with Lightning Bolt is that it's counteractive, and it's not as good against Containment Priest, because let's say you play Entomb on a creature, and then you try to reanimate. In response they cast Containment Priest, which means you still have to have 1 red open to cast Lightning Bolt. So my initial thought was to play Seal of Fire in this instead of Lightning Bolt, because then you can play Seal of Fire and you don't have to keep mana open. And it worked quite well, to be honest. The only thing I struggled with was Death and Taxes still, because they play cards like the mother that protects them from red, which means you have to crack Seal of Fire on the mother, stuff like that. It's quite annoying. And Grim Lavamancer deals with these cards quite elegantly. You don't have any trouble to find enough cards in your graveyard for Grim Lavamancer. And Delver, which is generally a really hard matchup, all kinds of Delver decks is, but especially Buck Delver, of course, because of Deathrite Shaman. They don't really have a way to interact with an active Lavamancer, and it stops their clock quite efficiently. And they probably side out cards like Abrupt Decay and Tarmogoyf because they're just not really good, and then you can exploit that weakness by playing a small creature by itself that not only deals with their strongest cards against you, but also gives you enough time to accumulate a few lands to start around Days and Wasteland, stuff like that. Another deck you have quite a lot of trouble with is, well, originally it was Miracles, but I guess like blue-white control is still seeing some play, or other decks with a lot of counter magic. And to play through counter magic, you can either try to overload their counter magic with Thoughtseize and Show and Tell, or you can try to dodge it with like Boseiyu, which is kind of funky, but it can work. When Miracle still was a real deck, I played two of these just to enable Show and Tell, and they usually didn't have a way to interact with Boseiyu. And what I also liked quite a bit was Koth of the Hammer, because if you consider how the blue-white decks are going to interact with you is mostly through counter magic, and they probably will board out some removal, but even if they leave it in, they don't really have a way to interact with planeswalkers, and Koth is just really strong because it has a fast clock and you need like, what is it, 2 activations to get to your ultimate, and the ultimate wins ridiculously fast, of course. And the initial thought behind Koth of the Hammer was it's hard to counter. Red Elemental Blast doesn't catch it, Flusterstorm doesn't catch it, so you basically are down to Force of Will and Counterspell. And with Counterbalance, you very rarely hit 4 mana, because the only real card you play is Chase the Mind Sculptor. So they have a really hard time of countering your Koth of the Hammer, and once it's on the board they don't have a way to interact with it, because spot removal usually doesn't cut it. You play 3 mountains, so they would have to deal with 3 creatures, and then well, alright. But I mean, it's still it's a horrifyingly bad trade for them. And it also dodges refs, because in their turn the mountains are no longer creatures. And you can switch between these. This is quite a lot of sideboarding against blue-white decks, stuff like that. So if you, let's say you reveal Koth of the Hammer in game 2, you can still side it out in game 3, because they might side in like Pithing Needle or Council's Judgment or Spell Pierce. I guess Spell Pierce they play anyways. But if they try boarding against Koth of the Hammer, your deck just gets generally stronger, or rather their deck gets weaker. The third category of graveyard hate is usually like Nihil Spellbomb, Relic of Progenitus, and Grafdigger's Cage. And I don't really have a lot of ways to interact with those, but they're usually just like a 1-off or 2-off, so it's probably not even worth bothering. You just try to be faster, or play counter magic, or Show and Tell, stuff like that. But I do have, however, 2 Ingot Chewers, because there's still some room in the sideboard, and Ingot Chewer is probably the best card because it also deals with Chalice of the Void, and it's quite good because when it gets, let's say he has a Nihil Spellbomb on the battlefield and you play Ingot Chewer, and he doesn't want you to deal with the Spellbomb, he counters the Ingot Chewer, but then you can just point a Reanimate at it and he's faced with the problem again. So this was the first deck, and the second deck I want to talk about is what I've been playing recently, which is a kind of Landstill deck, Still Legacy. I don't think I want to talk about the core of the deck too much. It's quite generic. There's a lot of spot removal and counter magic, obviously, and then you play Snapcasters and Jace the Mind Sculptor to get ahead. And once you've stabilized the board, you can drop a standstill, and from there it's usually quite easy to win the game, because once you start getting ahead in cards in hand, legacy decks don't really have comeback mechanics like vintage decks do. Usually there's not a lot of draw spells being played, so once you're ahead with standstill, you're pretty much closing out the game. So, what are issues of this deck? Well, first of all, cards that interact with your hand are quite annoying. So stuff like Hymn to Torridge can really get you behind. And secondly, a lot of people play like Buckfish or Jackpile, or rather that was my experience lately. And those decks play Leovold. And Leovold is quite annoying to deal with if you can't counter it. Your first approach should always be to force or counterspell it, but occasionally it just slips through. And once it's on the battlefield, it's quite annoying. It counters your chase heavily, it counters standstill insanely well, and even if you point removals at it, like Swords to Plowshares, he's still getting ahead. Like, he draws a card every time you try to interact with it. And that can be a real issue for the deck, because once you start getting behind, it's quite hard to catch up if you don't have like mass removal. Speaking of which, there's 2 cards that are mass removal, but they're not that reliable, because I guess Supreme Verdict is, but it still can be discarded by Hymn to Torridge or even Thoughtseize. So you can't really rely on those to work out. The second card that is quite annoying to deal with is True Name Nemesis, because you have a hard time of racing it. Your only real clock is a Gurmag Angler. And you first have to resolve that, and they might have some removal, and they're probably going to resolve True Name Nemesis before you can actually cast Gurmag Angler. So it's not really an answer, and again, as I said before, Supreme Verdict and Toxic Deluge are not that reliable. They're just one-offs. So, how do you deal with this issue? And I thought about this actually quite a bit, and I googled for some solutions, but I couldn't really come up with anything. And by sheer coincidence, I saw this card in a folder of a trader, and I was reading it because I didn't know it. And basically this is a functional reprint of Drop of Honey. So what it does is, at the beginning of your upkeep, you choose a creature with the lowest power, and this card destroys this creature. And obviously this card dies the second there are no creatures on the battlefield anymore. But the interesting thing about this card is it doesn't target. So cards like True Name Nemesis, if they're the lowest power creature on the battlefield, you can actually choose True Name Nemesis, just like with Council's Judgment. This card deals with True Name Nemesis as well. And the same goes for Leovold, because let's say they open with Deathrite Shaman into a second turn Leovold. If you play this card, then on your first upkeep you're going to destroy the Deathrite Shaman, and he doesn't get to draw a card because you don't actually target, you choose. And then on the second upkeep, the Leovold dies as well. And what's so interesting about this card is, not only does it destroy creatures without targeting, but it does it on multiple instances if there are several creatures on the battlefield, which means if he has like, let's say he has a Deathrite Shaman and a Tarmogoyf, you can play this card and immediately cast Standstill, because nodes will eventually sweep up the board. First it will get Deathrite Shaman, and then it will get Tarmogoyf. Then it will die, of course, but I mean it's a 1 mana spell, and it dealt with 2 creatures, and you still have Standstill on the board. So it works quite nicely at dealing with problematic creatures, and it also synergizes with Standstill really well. The second card I want to point out in the main deck is Gourmet Angler. It's not an amazing creature for what its cost is, but you can reliably cast it for very little mana within reasonable time. And what it does, it's basically a moat against many decks. And since like Jackpile and Buckfish don't have access to Swords to Plowshares, it's usually going to be there and just be obnoxiously annoying and hard to deal with. Like Fatal Push doesn't get it, Abrupt Decay doesn't get it. I guess Liliana gets it, but you also play Baleful Strix and Snapcaster Mage to kind of throw into. But Liliana is pretty good against the deck in general. I'm going to talk about Liliana quite a bit more. But most decks don't really have an effective way of dealing with a 5/5 effectively. If they don't produce like something bigger, but you have swords, and they usually don't, most decks anyway. So Angler is quite good. I think it's the best creature for this slot. I thought about playing True Name Nemesis myself, and Mendelian Click and more Snapcaster Mages, but Gourmet Angler solves a lot of problems and is really hard to deal with. And usually quite cheap as well, which is really important because you want to keep mana open at pretty much all times. So much for the main deck. Now for the sideboard, I'm not going to talk about a lot of matchups, but the 3 matchups I want to point out are Burn. Burn is an issue for the deck because there's no way you're going to counter enough burn spells, and there's no way you're going to race him, so you need a better solution for the matchup. The second one is again decks like Buckfish or Jackpile with Leovold, Deathrite Shaman, stuff like that. You're okay-ish to deal with the matchup main deck, but if you have a good sideboard it gets a lot easier. And the third matchup is Jaunt, and Jaunt is quite interesting actually, because Jaunt does a lot of things that basically negate your core of the deck. One of them is surely their discard. If they can get like a Wrath or a Standstill or a Planeswalker, you're basically down to 1/1 traits, and Jaunt is always going to come out on top. First of all, because they play very efficient cards like Bloodbraid Elf, like Punishing Fire, Planeswalker, stuff like that. So 1/1 traits are usually not going to work out in your favor. And secondly, Hymn to Torch usually it's just terrifying. It's just really bad for you. So I already have in the main deck a Divert and a Misdirection, and I think at the tournament I played a second Divert in the sideboard as well, specifically for this matchup, because it deals with Abrupt Decay and Hymn to Torch quite effectively, and if you divert a Hymn to Torch, you basically won the game in most cases. However, this card is still an issue, and you can't really rely on Divert. And something like Liliana is quite annoying to deal with, because they usually will have creatures on the board, so you can't really pressure it with Snapcaster Mages. or stuff like that. And it can even deal with a creature. And once Liliana is on the battlefield, you can't play standstill anymore. You just can't. This is actually the case for most planeswalkers, but Liliana specifically is quite hard to deal with, because first of all, when standstill is active, every time you draw a card you have to discard a card, so you don't really fill up your hand the way you usually do. And it gets to ultimate quite quickly, and the ultimate is usually quite bad. You're going to lose like at least half of your mana base, and it sucks. It just sucks. It's really bad. So what is the best card against this card and Liliana? You could play like Leyline of Sanctity. You could board these in, but it's not that effective against Liliana. It doesn't interact with their board, stuff like that. And my answer was to play Lingering Souls and Perish. Perish is obviously good because it deals with Tarmogoyf, Scavenging Ooze, Deathrite Shaman, Bloodbraid Elf. When you cast it, it usually trades quite well, and it's not that expensive. 3 mana is fine. But most importantly is Lingering Souls. Lingering Souls basically hard counters like 90% of their deck. Their only real clock is Tarmogoyf, stuff like that, which you don't really have any trouble dealing with. And it hard counters Liliana, it hard counters Hymn to Torage, it can still jump block Bloodbraid Elf quite easily. You don't care about Abrupt Decay or Lightning Bolt, stuff like that. And I was actually paired against Chant in the last tournament I played this deck with, and it felt tough. All games were quite grindy, and it was always Lingering Souls that eventually caught up to him. Like, yeah, you can maybe misdirect an Abrupt Decay or maybe even a Hymn to Torage to get ahead, but usually you're quite behind until you have like Lingering Souls. Lingering Souls is an amazing answer to the deck. By the way, you probably want to board out Force of Will in this matchup. It's only good for countering Liliana and possibly Hymn to Torage, but it's not something you want to do. You just much rather have Lingering Souls in your hand, and Force of Will usually gets you behind because you're either going to pitch like a Jace or a Brainstorm or a Standstill, and you can't really afford to do that. Also worth mentioning is Baleful Strix, which is also in the deck mostly to deal with Delver decks, with Tarmogoyf, stuff like that. It's usually a 2-for-1 trade in the Chant matchup as well. And if you consider playing this deck in a Chant heavy matchup, I probably would recommend playing like at least 3 main deck. So the second matchup is, I want to talk about this burn. And initially I had 2 Kambal, which are actually amazingly good, especially considering you play Misdirection, stuff like that. Because I mean, if you can't protect your Kambal, he's probably just going to die to a burn, and then it's still a favorable trade, but you're not going to win the game on the back of this. But it's decent. And the second card I played was Core Firewalker, which is of course very strong, but in reality, even if they do deal 2 damage instead of the 3, they will eventually probably get you because you can't really apply pressure. It's not like you play a Chite or something like that you can stick on the Core Firewalker, which some decks can, and that will usually win the game. You just can't do that. You can't. If you don't draw into Gourmet Angler to race, you're probably still going to lose. So the most efficient answer I could come up with was Leyline of Sanctity. And the second you have Leyline in your opening hand, you probably won the game. 1, they can't deal with the card because they play Mono Red. Mono Red doesn't have any enchantment removal. It's just it's not possible. And secondly, they're down to basically creatures, and your deck has a ridiculous amount of ways of dealing with creatures, be it you play 6 cards on 1 mana that already deal with creatures. You can force of will even a creature if you really have to. You can play like Snapcaster and Baleful Strix that will block, I think, all creatures. I think they can deal with all creatures Burn usually plays. Or even a Gourmag Angler and the game is just over. It's almost unfair actually. And interestingly, Leyline can be even boarded against Chant if you really are scared of their discard. And it's quite amazing with dealing with Storm. A, because they lose their discard, which means your counter magic is going to be way more effective. And secondly, if they want to kill you with Tendrils, they have to found a solution for the Leyline first. Which means they're going to lose speed, they're going to lose cards. They have to invest a lot to get to this point. So they're basically reduced to winning through empty the warrants and without any protection, and obviously that's not going to go so well for them. And the third matchup was, what did I say? Buckfish, yeah. So against Buckfish, surprisingly, their most effective cards are going to be Life from the Loam. And again, Leovold, Deathrite Shaman, and True Name Nemesis. And you already have a lot of main deck to deal with these cards. Like, Notes is really strong, your refs are really strong. But you kind of want to build on that, so you're probably going to play Perish, of course. Surgical Extraction is absolutely necessary for Life from the Loam, because it's really hard to beat Passport. Relic of Progenitus will be boarded in as well. It sort of delays the effectiveness of Deathrite Shaman. It shrinks Tarmogoyf. It's just generally a decent card. But you're already equipped with solutions to Leovold in general, in my opinion. Okay, I think I'm going to take a short break and then I will talk about the vintage decks.